Get on the ground, hands where we can see them. 6 patrol cars boxed in the quiet cul-de-sac before sunrise. Red and blue lights sweeping across drawn curtains up and down the street. 2 women in matching flannel pajamas stood frozen on their own front porch, coffee mugs still in hand, as officers fanned out across the lawn with weapons raised. Neighbors watched from behind blinds. Nobody on that street had any idea who these 2 women actually were. Would any of it have happened at all if someone had simply run the plate first? Where are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. Grace and Nora Bellamy had lived at 214 Larkspur Court for exactly 4 months when 6 patrol cars surrounded their house at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning in October. They were 25 years old, identical twins down to the small mole above Nora's left eyebrow that Grace had drawn on herself with an eyeliner pencil, more than once as kids, just to confuse their mother. They kept mostly to themselves on a street of retirees and young families, waved politely at the mail carrier, brought in each other's packages when one was out of town, and had, as far as any of their neighbors could tell, entirely unremarkable jobs that involved a lot of early mornings and even more late nights. What their neighbors did not know, what almost nobody in Larkspur Court's quiet, tree-lined subdivision knew, was that Grace and Nora Bellamy were both special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to a joint task force working financial crimes, tied to a shell company network that had, over the previous 14 months, moved something north of $90 million through a series of shuttered strip mall check cashing businesses across 3 states. They lived under their actual names because their cover, such as it was, had never needed to hide their identities, only their occupation. As far as the neighborhood was concerned, they worked in insurance, a phrase vague enough to end most conversations at a mailbox. The house on Larkspur Court had come up in an entirely different investigation 11 days earlier, a burglary ring operating out of a rented property 2 streets over, run by a pair of brothers using a stolen box truck and a set of forged utility company badges to case houses during the day. A confidential informant working with the local police department's property crimes unit had given a partial description of the ringleader's vehicle, a dark gray sedan, a specific make and model, with a partial plate ending in the digits 472. Detectives ran it through the county database that Monday night and got exactly 1 match within a 5-mile radius. A dark gray sedan registered to a Grace E. Bellamy, 214 Larkspur Court. Nobody cross-checked it against the FBI's Federal Employee Vehicle Registry, because nobody had a reason to think they needed to. Nobody called the number listed for the registered federal contact tied to Grace's vehicle, because that number sat 2 departments away from the property crimes unit that pulled the plate. Filed under a records access tier, most patrol sergeants never had occasion to open. A detective named Ray Kowalski, 38 years old, competent and overworked and running on 4 hours of sleep after a week of overtime, signed off on the address as the ringleader's residence based on the plate match alone, without waiting on the secondary confirmation his own captain would later say should have taken 40 minutes and had instead taken 0. At 6:15 the next morning, 6 patrol units rolled onto Larkspur Court with lights off until the last possible second, boxing in the driveway and both ends of the cul-de-sac. Grace was in the kitchen making coffee, still in flannel pajama pants and a faded Academy t-shirt, when she heard the first car door. Nora, 1 step behind her with her own mug in hand, reached the front window half a second later and went very still. "Grace," she said quietly, "that's not a delivery." They opened the door together, because neither of them had ever once, in 6 years on the job, considered running from a knock. 6 officers stood arrayed across the lawn, weapons drawn but low, one already shouting the standard command, hands visible. Get on the ground, the particular cadence of a team executing what they believed, with total sincerity, was a felony burglary warrant against 2 dangerous suspects. Grace set her mug down on the porch railing with the careful, unhurried motion of someone who has been trained, extensively, in exactly what fast movements do to a situation like this. Nora did the same beside her. "We're going to reach very slowly for our IDs," Grace said, her voice pitched low and level. The tone she used on interview subjects twice her size, who were 3 seconds from doing something they'd regret. "They're in our robe pockets. Nobody needs to move fast here." The lead officer on scene, a 12-year veteran named Sergeant Dana Whitfield, was not interested in nuance at 6:15 in the morning with a burglary warrant in hand and 2 matching suspects standing exactly where the plate said they'd be. She ordered them to the ground instead, and the twins trained disciplined. And entirely aware of how badly this could go if they argued with an officer holding a raised weapon at a residential address before sunrise, got down on the cold concrete of their own front porch. Without another word, cuffs went on. Grace felt the familiar click of a mechanism she'd applied to other people's wrists more times than she could count, now closing around her own, and said nothing. Nora, beside her, kept her face turned toward the porch boards and breathed slowly through her nose. The exact technique both of them had been taught for de-escalating their own adrenaline in exactly this kind of moment. Except neither of them had ever run the drill from this side of it. A neighbor 2 doors down, a retired schoolteacher named Marjorie Voss, watched from behind her kitchen blinds and would later tell a local reporter that she'd never in 11 years on that street seen anything like it. Those 2 sweet girls, face down on their own porch in their pajamas like it was a television show. It took 11 minutes. Grace counted every one of them silently, the way she'd counted breaths in worse rooms than this. Before Sergeant Whitfield knelt down to pat search the robe pocket Grace had pointed to and pulled out. Instead of a stolen ID or a burner phone or any of the dozen things property crimes detectives half expect to find on a burglary suspect, a black leather federal credential wallet with a gold shield and a photo ID that read, in plain block letters beneath Grace's unsmiling academy photograph, "Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation." Sergeant Whitfield did not say anything for a long moment. She looked at the credential. She looked at Grace, cuffed and face down on the porch in flannel pants. She looked at Nora, still cuffed beside her sister, and asked, because at that point there was genuinely nothing else useful to ask, whether there was a matching one in the other pocket. There was. What happened over the following 90 minutes is the part most people, hearing the story secondhand later, assumed would be dramatic: shouting, accusations, a lawsuit threatened on the spot. It wasn't, not really, not in the way people expect. Grace and Nora had both spent enough time on the other side of exactly this kind of error to understand, immediately and without needing to be told, precisely how it had happened. A plate match, a missed cross-reference, a detective running on no sleep who trusted a database that had no reason to flag a federal vehicle as anything other than a civilian one, because the flag itself lived in a system that property crimes detectives simply didn't have routine access to. Sergeant Whitfield removed the cuffs herself, her hands notably less steady than they'd been 11 minutes earlier, and offered an apology that was, by any professional standard, appropriate and immediate. She'd acted on a plate match tied to an active burglary investigation, she said, and she took full responsibility for not slowing down to verify further before executing at the residence. Grace, sitting on her own porch step now with her wrists still faintly marked, listened to the apology and nodded once. "You followed a lead that pointed here," she said. "That part isn't the problem. I've made faster calls than that on worse information." She paused, rubbing one wrist. "The problem is whatever gap let a federal vehicle registration sit in a database your unit could query, without a flag telling you to slow down and check with someone first. That's not on you personally. That's on whoever built the system you were trusting." It was, Nora would say later, a very Grace thing to say, already diagnosing the structural failure instead of sitting with the personal one. 5 minutes after being cuffed on her own porch in her pajamas, the twins didn't file a formal complaint against Sergeant Whitfield individually, and both of them said so, clearly, within the hour. Not because nothing had gone wrong, but because they'd both spent enough years inside federal law enforcement to know exactly the difference between an officer making a defensible call on bad information and an officer doing something that actually deserved discipline. What they did do by that afternoon was request a meeting, not with the patrol division, but with the chief of the local department directly, and separately, a call to their own FBI field office supervisor, a 22-year veteran named Assistant Special Agent in Charge Daniel Osai, who listened to the full account without interrupting once and then asked exactly one question. Had the twins been physically harmed? They hadn't been, not in any way that showed, but something in the silence after Grace answered that question told Osai the conversation wasn't actually over, and he was right. Grace requested access to the original warrant packet the following morning, a request she was, by any reasonable standard, entitled to make given the circumstances, and one the local department's chief, a soft-spoken 30-year veteran named Chief Arthur Prout, granted without hesitation, largely because he understood, the moment he heard the full story, exactly how badly this could have gone and how quietly the local department had, in fact, dodged something considerably worse than an apology and a bruised wrist. What Grace found in the packet, sitting at her own kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, was not what she expected. The plate match to her registered vehicle was accurate. That part of the error was simple, explainable, forgivable. What wasn't simple was the informant statement underlying the entire warrant, which described not just a vehicle but a specific pattern of activity at the Larkspur Court address over the preceding 3 weeks, deliveries at odd hours, a garage door that opened and closed at irregular times overnight, unfamiliar vehicles parked briefly in the driveway before leaving. Grace read it twice, and then a third time because she recognized every detail in it, not as evidence of a burglary ring, but as an accurate description of her and Nora's actual, entirely legitimate work schedule, which involved surveillance shifts that started and ended at genuinely strange hours, occasional visits from other agents coordinating logistics for the Shell Company case, and a garage that, yes, opened and closed more than a retired schoolteacher 2 doors down might consider normal. The informant, it turned out, was not describing a burglary cruise reconnaissance of the neighborhood. He was describing Grace and Nora's own comings and goings, misread by someone watching the street for entirely different reasons, and folded, whether through simple confusion or something considerably less innocent, into the burglary ring's case file as though it were evidence of the ring itself casing a future target. That distinction mattered more than it might have seemed at first glance. Because if a civilian informant working an active property crimes case had been quietly and specifically watching 2 federal agents' house closely enough to log the timing of their comings and goings for 3 weeks, that was not simply a case of mistaken identity anymore. That was something Grace's training told her needed a considerably more careful look. She brought it to Osai the next morning, laid the informant statement beside the actual dates and times of her and Nora's documented shift logs from the Shell Company task force, and watched her supervisor's expression shift from mild professional concern into something considerably more focused. "You're telling me," Osai said slowly, "that somebody was logging your movements specifically, closely enough to notice a pattern, and that log ended up folded into an unrelated burglary case file. I'm telling you, I don't think it's a coincidence that it happened 11 days before a search warrant landed on our door," Grace said. "And I think whoever that informant actually is deserves a considerably harder look than the property crimes unit gave him. It took 6 days of quiet, careful cross-referencing, Grace working the informant's known associates against the Shell Company task force's own suspect list, Nora pulling financial records on 3 of the burglary ring's known fences, before the pattern resolved into something neither twin had expected, though both, in hindsight, understood immediately why it made a certain grim sense. The confidential informant behind the burglary warrant, a man named Curtis Dahl who'd been cooperating with the Property Crimes Unit in exchange for leniency on an unrelated charge, had a second, considerably less official relationship. As a low-level courier for one of the shell companies at the center of the exact financial crimes investigation Grace and Nora had spent 14 months building. Dahl hadn't been watching Larkspur Court because he suspected a burglary target. He'd been watching it because someone inside the shell company network had grown suspicious of the two women in the quiet house with the odd hours and the occasional unmarked visitors, and had asked Dahl, through two intermediaries who never used the actual word federal agents in any recorded conversation, to keep an eye on the property and report anything unusual. When Dahl's burglary ring cooperation put him in a room with Detective Kowalski 11 days later, and Kowalski asked whether he'd noticed any suspicious activity near a specific gray sedan's registered address, Dahl had, whether out of genuine confusion, self-preservation, or something more deliberate that the eventual internal investigation never fully resolved, offered up 3 weeks of surveillance notes on exactly the wrong case, notes that read, on paper, like burglary reconnaissance, and were in reality the shell company network quietly trying to determine whether the two women on Larkspur Court were federal agents before deciding what to do about it. "They were casing us," Nora said, when Grace laid it all out on the kitchen table 6 nights later, the same table where the whole thing had started with a cup of coffee gone cold. "Not the burglary crew, the people we've been investigating for 14 months. They were trying to figure out if we were onto them." And a local detective walked straight into the middle of it without knowing what he was actually looking at. The revelation reframed everything that followed. What had started as an embarrassing procedural failure, a plate match, a missed cross-check, 6 patrol cars and 2 cuffed federal agents on their own front porch, became, within the task force, the first solid confirmation that the shell company network had identified Grace and Nora specifically, which meant the entire operational security model for the remaining phase of the investigation needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, on an accelerated timeline, before the network could act on what it now knew. Grace and Nora were moved to a secure temporary residence within 48 hours, a decision neither of them fought, because both understood exactly what it meant that someone tracking a $90 million fraud network had cared enough to log 3 weeks of their movements. The Joint Task Force, working now with considerably more urgency and a piece of intelligence it hadn't had a week earlier, moved up its planned enforcement action by nearly a month, executing coordinated search warrants across 4 states on a Thursday morning that netted 11 arrests, the seizure of assets exceeding $60 million, and perhaps most satisfying to Grace, who read the final case summary sitting in the same secure apartment she and Nora had been relocated to, direct confirmation that the network's suspicion about being watched had originated with exactly the misfiled surveillance notes that had, 11 days earlier, put both twins face down and cuffed on their own front porch. Detective Ray Kowalski, for his part, was not disciplined in any formal sense. The internal review concluded correctly that he had acted on a legitimate plate match within the normal scope of his authority, and that the actual failure sat considerably higher up, in a record system that had never flagged federal vehicle registrations for a secondary verification step before a warrant could be executed at the associated address. That gap was closed within 2 weeks, department-wide, a change Chief Prout personally credited to Grace's written recommendation, which she drafted the same night she found the informant discrepancy. less out of anger than out of the same instinct that had made her diagnose the structural failure on her own porch step, before the cuffs were even fully off her wrists. Sergeant Dana Whitfield reached out to Grace personally, 3 weeks after the incident, not through any formal channel but with a handwritten note delivered to the field office, an apology, again, along with a request, if Grace was ever willing, to sit down with the department's new officer training cohort and talk through what had actually happened that morning. From the other side of the cuffs, as a case study. Grace agreed and did the session herself without theatrics, laying out exactly what had gone wrong and exactly what a slower, more careful 90 seconds could have prevented, not to embarrass anyone, but because she understood better than most people in that room ever would, precisely how much weight sits inside a single unverified assumption at 6:15 in the morning. Nora, characteristically the quieter of the two, took a different kind of satisfaction from the whole affair. She'd been the one to notice, 3 days into reviewing the case file, that Curtis Dahl's cooperation agreement with the Property Crimes Unit had a clause allowing it to be voided if he was found to have withheld material information. A clause the Property Crimes Unit had never had reason to invoke until Nora quietly flagged, in writing, exactly what Dahl had actually been doing on Larkspur Court for 3 weeks. Grace and Nora moved back into the house on Larkspur Court 4 months later, once the shell company case had concluded and the operational need for relocation had passed. Marjorie Voss, the retired schoolteacher 2 doors down, brought over a casserole on their first evening back, and told them, with the particular bluntness only a long-time neighbor can manage, that she'd never quite worked up the nerve to ask what insurance actually meant, and that she supposed now she understood why the odd hours and the strange visitors had never quite added up to anything she could name. Grace just smiled and told her it was close enough to the truth for the neighborhood to keep believing. The 2 federal credential wallets that had ended up, briefly, in Sergeant Whitfield's hands on a cold October porch now sit in a drawer in the twins' shared front hallway, where they've sat every morning since, ready to be pocketed on the way out the door, a small, deliberate reminder, Grace says, that the difference between a catastrophic morning and merely a very bad one sometimes comes down to nothing more than 90 seconds nobody thought they had time to spend, and a plate number that, on its own, never tells anyone the whole story.